The wedding was supposed to be a celebration, a day of beauty, laughter, and memory-making. But for her, the moment she walked into the kitchen and overheard the hushed conversation between two aunts, the air shifted. "We still just have her watch the kids. She sits responsible, isn't she? 15 children should be fine." The words landed like a stone in her chest. 15 kids. At a wedding. Not her wedding. Not her child. Not her responsibility. And yet, in that single sentence, her role for the day had been assigned without her consent. That's where our story begins. It wasn't about the children themselves. It wasn't even about the wedding. It was about the casual way her worth had been dismissed. She was invited as family, but positioned as labor. She was expected to carry the invisible weight that no one else wanted. And here sets the truth you need to sit with. Exploitation rarely announces itself as cruelty. It arrives dressed as tradition, obligation, or helping out. She smiled politely when the request was formally made. Everyone was watching. The air smelled of perfume, fresh linen, and tension. The bride's nerves were visible. The groom's family buzzing with ceremony. It should have been joyous. Yet in the background, she felt her identity collapsing into a single unspoken assumption. You're here to serve, not to shine. Now, let's pause here. Because this is the inciting incident. The moment that reveals something deeper about the structures around us. Here sits what that moment teaches us. Exploitation often begins with silence. The kind where you feel a no in your bones, but the pressure to say yes coils around you like a rope. She didn't know it yet, but that wedding would become a battlefield, not with screaming or chaos, but with strategy, dignity, and the quiet courage to say, no, not this time. And as she stood there, torn between keeping the peace and protecting her own worth, the audience, you, must ask yourself, how many times have you been assigned a role you didn't choose, simply because people assumed you'd accept it? That sips the doorway into this story. Because this isn't just about babysitting, it's about boundaries. It's about invisible labor. It's about the courage it takes to disappoint people in order to honor yourself. And by the end of this journey, you'll see how a single choice at a wedding, to stop being everyone else's solution, can transform not only one woman's life, but ripple through a family, a culture, even a system. But we said we're not there yet. For now, picture her standing in that room, music faintly spilling in from the rehearsal hall, children already tugging at her sleeve, sensing what the adults had planned, relatives smiling, nodding, assuming she'd agree. Her heart raced. Her hands trembled just slightly. She wanted to vanish into the wallpaper. But instead, she drew in a breath and whispered a single sentence to herself, one that would carry her through the next 24 hours. I don't have to accept this. She didn't know it yet, but that thought was the first spark of a fire no one expected. And as we step deeper into her story, you'll see exactly how one quiet refusal can flip an entire outcome, and why the cost of silence is often far greater than the cost of resistance. Before we judge her reaction, we need to rewind. Because moments like this don't come out of nowhere. They are the accumulation of years, even decades, of quiet conditioning. She grew up in a family where responsibility always seemed to find her first. The oldest daughter, the dependable one, the one who never made too much noise, who followed instructions, who picked up the slack when others faltered. At birthday parties, she was the one slicing the cake and making sure everyone else had a plate before she did. At church, she was the one corralling the toddlers in the back pew while the adults worshipped without interruption. At family reunions, she was the one asked to keep an eye on the younger cousins so the grown folks could talk. And here's what that moment teaches us. Roles assigned in childhood have a way of following us into adulthood, whether we accept them or not. By the time the wedding came around, the pattern was already decades in the making. To her family, it wasn't an insult. It was habit. Of course she'd be the babysitter. She always had been. To question that role was to break an unspoken contract, to challenge a script that had been rehearsed since her earliest years. But let's peel back another layer. Why was she always the responsible one? Why her, and not the others? Some of it had to do with birth order psychology. Studies show that firstborns are often saddled with leadership and caretaking responsibilities, whether they ask for them or not. But some of it was cultural. In many families, especially in communities where survival depends on shared labor, girls are often taught that their worth lies in how much they can carry. Not in how much they can create, or how boldly they can dream, but in how seamlessly they can support others. She carried that script quietly, like invisible luggage. She excelled in school, but when report cards came home, the praise was always softer than the requests. "That SEP's good, baby. Now can you watch your cousin for me this weekend?" She went to college, but when she returned home for holidays, her education didn't exempt her from duty. She still found herself in kitchens, folding chairs and back rooms, managing chaos that no one else wanted to manage. And here sips the cruel irony: responsibility disguised as praise is one of the easiest traps to fall into. People say, "We trust you," but what they really mean is, "We expect you to sacrifice more than others." By the time she stood in that kitchen on the day of the wedding, the pattern was so old it almost felt natural. But something was shifting inside her. See, the thing about carrying everyone else's load is this: eventually you start to wonder who will carry yours. She had been wrestling with that question for months before the wedding. Quietly, silently, alone. She had started to notice how drained she felt after every family gathering, how invisible she seemed when she wasn't solving problems for other people. She had begun journaling late at night, writing sentences like, "I want to be seen for me, not just for what I do for others." And so when the wedding came, that request to watch 15 children wasn't just one more duty, it was a test, a trigger. The final straw in a long line of moments where she had been told, indirectly but unmistakably, that her needs were secondary. She didn't know it yet, but the babysitting request was never about the kids. It was about identity. Because if she said yes, she'd be affirming the script. She'd be teaching them, and herself, that her place in the family was to serve quietly in the background, invisible in moments of joy, carrying burdens no one else wanted. But if she said no, well, that would change everything. It would mark the first time she rewrote her role. And the cost of that would not just be awkwardness, it would be resistance, anger, even rejection. Here's what that teaches us. Every family, every system, relies on unspoken agreements. But growth often requires breaking those agreements, even when it hurts. As she stood in that kitchen, listening to her aunts finalize their plan for her, she wasn't just hearing words, she was hearing history. Every unpaid babysitting session, every unacknowledged sacrifice, every moment her voice had been drowned out in service of others. And deep down, she knew if she gave in again today, she might never stop. That's why this backstory matters. Because when we get to her decision, you'll understand it wasn't impulsive. It was decades in the making. And so, we end this part of her story, not with an answer, but with a question. What happens when the role you've been assigned your whole life collides with the person you're becoming? That sets the collision we are about to witness. The request had been spoken. Smiles had been exchanged. The expectation had been set. And now, she stood in the hallway outside the reception hall, pressed against the wall, as if the plaster might absorb her anxiety. On the other side of the door, laughter and music spilled from the rehearsal dinner. Behind her, children darted past in bursts of energy, their shoes squeaking on the polished floor. Her chest felt heavy. Her mind split into two voices, one whispering compliance, the other whispering defiance. The first voice was familiar. It said, "Just do it. It sits only one night. Keep the peace. Don't sit ruin the wedding. Everyone sits counting on you. If you refuse, they sit will call you selfish, dramatic, ungrateful." The second voice was quieter, but sharper. It said, "If you agree, you still vanish." Again, you still miss the ceremony, the photos, the laughter. You still spend the day chasing toddlers while everyone else makes memories. You still prove them right, that you exist to serve, not to celebrate. Here's what that moment teaches us. Real dilemmas don't arrive with clear villains or easy exits. They come disguised as choices between discomfort and betrayal, the discomfort of standing firm or the betrayal of yourself. She pressed her palms together, trying to steady her breathing. She imagined herself sitting in a back room with 15 restless children while music boomed from the dance floor. She pictured the family photo albums years from now, everyone smiling in gowns and tuxedos, except her absence unacknowledged, her labor erased. That vision burned. And then she imagined the alternative, refusing, saying no, watching the smiles fade, the whispers rise, the judgment cut deep. She imagined the accusations, "After all we've done for you, you can't even help for one night?" She pictured her mother's disappointed eyes, her cousin's smirks, her aunt's sharp tongue. Either path carried a cost. And this is where the real suspense lives, not in whether or not she can physically manage 15 children, but in whether she can endure the weight of her family's disapproval. Because sometimes the greater fear isn't failure. It's rejection. She leaned against the wall, closing her eyes for a moment. Inside, a voice rose stronger than before. "This is a fork in the road. Whatever you decide here, they will remember, and so will you." Psychologists call this a boundary moment, a test of identity, where the choice you make not only defines how others see you, but how you see yourself. Every boundary moment rewrites the script of your life. She didn't know it yet, but this was the test she had been unconsciously preparing for. All those journal entries, all those nights of quiet resentment, all those years of suppressed disappointment, they converged here in this hallway, on this night. Her heart pounded harder. She replayed her Aunt Sep's casual words. "She Sep's responsible. 15 children should be fine." Responsible. That word stung, because responsibility without respect is exploitation. She had been the family's safety net for years. But what happens when the net decides not to catch anyone this time? She took another deep breath, then opened her eyes. Her reflection in the hallway mirror stared back at her, tired, beautiful, trembling, but resolute. She whispered under her breath, "I can go back to disappearing." And that was it. The line in the sand. She hadn't spoken it aloud yet, not to them. But inside, she had crossed the moral fork in the road. She would not babysit 15 children at this wedding. She would not miss her cousin's vows, her aunt's tears, her family's joy. She would not exchange her presence for their convenience. And though she didn't yet know how the family would respond, one thing was certain, her decision would not only change this night, it would change every gathering that followed. Here sits the truth. A single action can flip the entire outcome, and hers was about to. But before that transformation, there would be resistance. The system, whether a family, a culture, or an institution, does not let go of its unspoken contracts without a fight. So as she squared her shoulders and prepared to rejoin the reception, the question lingered. When she finally says no, who will stand with her, and who will turn against her? She returned to the reception hall, but this time she carried something different. Not a tray, not a diaper bag, not the invisible weight of everyone else's expectations. She carried resolve. It was invisible to them, but it pulsed in her chest like a steady drumbeat. She slipped into her chair at the long family table, smiling when greeted, nodding politely at the cousins who teased her for being too serious. On the outside, she looked the same as always, the dependable one, the helper, the quiet backbone of the family. But inside, a shift had begun. Here's what that moment teaches us. True power doesn't always arrive with noise or spectacle. Sometimes it comes in silence, the kind of silence that's rooted in unshakable clarity. She looked around the room and noticed details she had overlooked before. The way her aunts leaned back comfortably, relieved at the assumption that she would handle the chaos of 15 restless children. The way her uncle joked about how she always knew how to keep kids in line. The way no one asked if she even wanted the role, as if her preference didn't exist. And then she noticed something else. The children themselves. Running, laughing, tugging at napkins, already restless before the main event even began. It wasn't malice, they were simply children being children. But to place their entire collective energy on one person's shoulders, that wasn't responsibility. That was erasure. For the first time, she saw the scene not as a duty, but as data, as a strategist would. She began to recall frameworks she had read about in quiet hours. Essays on emotional labor, studies on gendered expectations, the psychology of role assignment in families. She remembered a phrase from one book: "The invisible work you do is often the clearest measure of how others value you, intuit you." And in that moment, her invisible work became visible to her. That was her hidden intelligence, not just her ability to manage chaos, but her ability to see through it. To analyze the situation not as an obligation, but as a system. She thought back to her job, a place where, unlike at home, she was respected. There, her strategic mind was valued. There, her ability to organize, to anticipate, to prevent problems before they arose, those qualities earned her promotions. Yet here, in this room, those same qualities had been reduced to "you're good with kids." The insult wasn't the babysitting itself. The insult was the refusal to see her fully. And here's the turning point. When you recognize that others are blind to your value, you have two choices. You can shrink to fit their vision, or you can stand tall and demand they widen their gaze. She didn't know it yet, but she was already choosing the second. Her hidden power wasn't loud rebellion. It wasn't slamming doors or shouting across tables. It was something sharper, the ability to wait, to watch, and to strike with precision at the right moment. That's why, when her aunt approached her during the meal, leaning down, whispering casually, "After dinner you'll take the kids over to the side room, right?" she didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled. And for the first time in her life, that smile didn't mean yes. It meant, "I've already decided, and it's not what you think." A single action flipped the entire outcome. She didn't argue, didn't explain, didn't justify. She simply allowed the silence to hold. Her aunt, expecting quick compliance, blinked in confusion. For the first time there was hesitation in her tone. "You will, one set you." And that hesitation was everything, because hesitation is the first crack in assumption. She hadn't spoken yet, but she had shifted the balance. The power in this moment wasn't about babysitting. It was about teaching the family, gently, strategically, that the old script no longer applied. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to defend her decision. All she needed was the quiet intelligence of someone who finally understood her worth. And as she sat back in her chair, watching her aunt walk away uncertain, she felt it, the first small reversal of power. It was subtle, almost invisible. But revolutions often start that way. Because here sits the truth. Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. And in that whisper lies the beginning of transformation. Every shift in power creates resistance. Families, like systems, are designed to protect their balance, even if that balance rests on someone else's sacrifice. Her silence at the table hadn't gone unnoticed. By dessert, whispers began, small at first, then sharper. "Why's she acting funny?" one cousin muttered. "You know she's always the one who handles things," another replied. It spread like smoke. By the time the cake was being served, the assumption had been challenged enough that the family could feel it. Something was off. And then came the confrontation. Her aunt returned, this time not whispering. Standing over her chair, voice just loud enough to draw attention, she said, "We need you to take the kids now. Everyone sits expecting it." The words hit like a gavel. Around the table, forks paused mid-air, conversation stilled, all eyes turned. She looked up, calm but steady. "I won't be able to do that tonight," she said quietly. Gasps. A few chuckles. One uncle even leaned back, shaking his head like she'd lost her mind. The Aunt Sip's smile stiffened. "What do you mean you won Stet? You stare the best with them. The kids love you." She breathed deeply. "I came here to be part of the celebration, not to miss it." And there it was, her boundary, spoken aloud. But here's what that moment teaches us. Boundaries rarely land gently. To people who benefit from your silence, your no will always feel like rebellion. Her Aunt Sip's face hardened. "Oh, so you think you set her too good now? After everything this family Sip's done for you?" The words cut deeper than intended. Murmurs rose around the table, cousins smirking, elders frowning, children watching wide-eyed. And then came the humiliation. Another relative chimed in, voice laced with venom. "See? This is what happens when people get educated. Forget where they came from. Forget family." It was an ambush. The kind families sometimes stage unconsciously, a collective defense of tradition, coated in shame. Her hands trembled under the table. Her throat tightened. In that moment, she felt the weight of every stereotype, every expectation, every unspoken rule crashing down. She tried to sip water, but the glass clinked loudly against her teeth. For the first time that night, she looked fragile, exposed under the scrutiny of people she loved. And here's the cruel irony. When you finally stand up for yourself, it often looks to others like weakness, not strength. Her cousin laughed from across the table. "Girl, it sits just babysitting. Don't sit, act brand new." Another aunt leaned in, whispering just loud enough. "Ungrateful." The words seared. For a split second, doubt surged. Maybe they were right. Maybe she was selfish. Maybe she should just swallow it. Sacrifice again, disappear one more time. Her chest burned. Tears threatened to rise. She excused herself quickly, slipping out into the hallway before anyone could see her break. The music from the reception grew louder as she walked further away, her heels clicking against the tiled floor. She found an empty corridor, leaned against the wall, and let out a shaky breath she'd been holding since dinner began. Here sits the breaking point. Every transformation requires a collapse. You must face the cost before you can claim the prize. She slid down to the floor, dress pooling around her, and for the first time that night, the tears came. Not just from the confrontation, but from the years of invisible labor that had led here. She wept not because she was weak, but because she was tired. Tired of carrying, tired of disappearing, tired of being told her worth was conditional. And in that breakdown, the story pivoted. Because breakdowns often come before breakthroughs. But in this moment, sitting on that cold floor, she didn't feel powerful. She felt small, alone, doubting whether her stand was worth it. She didn't know it yet, but this public humiliation, this raw collapse, was the soil from which her transformation would grow. Because sometimes you must be brought to your knees before you can rise. She sat alone in that corridor, dress crumpled, mascara smudging slightly at the corner of her eyes. The echo of laughter and music from the reception hall mocked her isolation. 15 kids were still running somewhere, and her family was probably telling the story of her rebellion at the table. For a moment she felt like a child again, scolded, cornered, misunderstood. But then, something shifted. Her phone buzzed. A message lit up the screen. It was from her mentor, a professor she stayed close to after college, someone who had guided her through papers, job interviews, and the early struggles of adulthood. The message was simple. Remember, boundaries don't destroy relationships. They clarify them. She stared at those words. Boundaries don't destroy relationships. They clarify them. It was like oxygen filling her lungs. The pressure in her chest loosened. She replayed the dinner scene in her mind, her aunt's anger, the whispers, the accusations. and for the first time, she saw it differently. Her no hadn't been selfish. It had been clarifying. It had revealed who saw her as a whole person and who only saw her as free labor. Here's what that moment teaches us. Transformation begins not when the world validates you, but when you validate yourself. She wiped her tears and pulled herself up from the floor. The music was still playing, but she wasn't rushing back to explain, to apologize, or to beg for understanding. Instead, she began to think strategically. If her family saw her as the dependable one, she could use that perception to her advantage, but on her terms. She wouldn't babysit. But she could still contribute, still show presence, still honor the day without disappearing. Her mind moved like a chessboard. What if, instead of retreating, she returned calmly and redefined her role? What if she chose visibility instead of invisibility? What if her stand wasn't about confrontation, but about quiet, undeniable presence? She took another breath and whispered to herself, "I am not their babysitter. I am their equal." And in that moment, resolve crystallized into strategy. She straightened her dress, fixed her makeup in the mirror, and walked back toward the reception. Her steps weren't hurried anymore. They were deliberate, almost ceremonial. Each click of her heels on the floor was a declaration, "I belong here." This was the spark. The collapse had given birth to clarity. The humiliation had given her strength. The no was no longer just a refusal. It was a redefinition. She didn't need to win the family's approval. She needed to reclaim her presence. Psychologists call this a cognitive reframe, when you shift the way you interpret a situation, and suddenly the same moment that once crushed you becomes the fuel that lifts you. She didn't know it yet, but this shift would change everything. Because from this moment on, she wasn't just reacting, she was leading. As she reached the reception doors, she whispered one last time, "They may not understand tonight, but they will remember." And with that, she walked back into the hall, not as the family babysitter, but as the woman who had just rewritten her role. The question now was simple. How would she execute this new plan? And how would the family respond when they realized the old script no longer held? She didn't rush toward the kids. She didn't slip back into the corner of duty. Instead, she moved through the reception hall like someone who had every right to be seen. The music swelled. Couples twirled on the dance floor. Her cousins shouted inside jokes across tables. And she, instead of sliding into the shadows, chose a seat near the front, a visible seat. At first, no one noticed. Then her aunt, the same one who had scolded her earlier, glanced over with a flicker of surprise. Surely, she thought, the girl would retreat to the children soon, but she didn't. She poured herself a glass of water, smiled at the bride, clapped as the best man raised a toast. Every gesture was quiet, deliberate, undeniable. Here's the beauty of strategy. Sometimes the most powerful moves are the ones that look like nothing at all. The family kept waiting for her to resume the role. The babysitter, the caretaker, the one who sacrificed without being asked, but instead, she stayed. She laughed. She leaned into conversation. She existed as part of the celebration, not the labor behind it. A small rebellion, cloaked in normalcy. One cousin, half joking, whispered, "Aren't you supposed to be with the kids?" She smiled, calm and unbothered, and answered softly, "Tonight, I sip celebrating like everyone else." No anger, no debate, just clarity. That single line landed heavier than any argument could. Because here's what that moment teaches us. Authority isn't always claimed in loud speeches. Sometimes it's embodied in quiet decisions that no one can shake. Meanwhile, she noticed something. The children, those 15 impossible tasks, weren't in chaos. A few older cousins had stepped in naturally. A couple of parents had shifted their attention. The world hadn't collapsed without her. And that was the revelation. The system only demanded her sacrifice because she kept supplying it. Remove the supply, and suddenly, others discovered they were capable too. Psychologists call this pattern interruption, breaking a cycle so ingrained that no one questioned it until someone dared to stop feeding it. This wasn't about being selfish. It was about balance. It was about showing that she wasn't the only solution, and that everyone had a role to play. She began to notice subtle changes. Her grandmother, who had always looked at her with approving eyes when she helped, now studied her with something else: curiosity. Her younger cousins saw her dressed beautifully at the table, not burdened by childcare, and maybe, just maybe, imagined that they too didn't always have to be the helper. Change was happening, even if no one admitted it aloud. And through it all, she didn't set gloat. She didn't make speeches or pick fights. She simply lived the truth of her new role. Quiet wins, no applause yet, but the room was watching. Each moment she remained seated at that table was a stone in the foundation of a new identity. Each laugh she shared with family members on equal footing was a gentle reminder: I am not invisible. The climb had begun. Not dramatic, not public yet, but steady. And perhaps the most profound moment came when the bride herself, exhausted but radiant, walked over, hugged her tightly, and whispered, "Thank you for being here tonight. I needed you in the room, not outside of it." She didn't know it yet, but that sentence was a prophecy of what was to come. Because presence, when chosen deliberately, is more powerful than sacrifice made out of guilt. And this was only the beginning. The silent climb was working. The question now was, when the moment of public confrontation came, would her quiet authority be enough to shift the balance completely? The evening stretched on. Glasses clinked, cameras flashed, speeches rose and fell like waves. And through it all, she remained steady at her table, no longer hidden, no longer erased. But every quiet revolution eventually faces its moment of reckoning. It came when the cake was about to be served. One of the uncles, already tipsy and loose with words, chuckled loudly and said, "Well, I don't know how you I'll let her sit here all night. Shouldn't she be with those kids? That sip's what she sips good at, right?" The laughter that followed wasn't cruel, but it was dismissive, the kind that slices deep because it pretends to be harmless. The table froze. She felt the heat of eyes flick toward her, some curious, some pitying, some waiting to see if she'd shrink again. But this time, she didn't shrink. She set her glass down, turned her head slowly toward her uncle, and smiled. Not sharp, not bitter, but steady. "Actually," she said, voice calm but carrying, "tonight I'm here to celebrate, just like everyone else. And I think the kids are doing just fine without me." The words were simple, but the silence that followed was electric. Her aunt's fork hovered mid-air. A cousin choked back a laugh. Even the bride and groom, standing at the front, caught the exchange and raised their brows with interest. It was as though she had shattered a glass wall no one admitted was there. Here's what that moment teaches us. Sometimes, the most powerful reversal isn't about inventing a new truth. It's about speaking aloud the truth everyone already knows, but is too afraid to name. The uncle tried to laugh it off, muttering something about just joking. But the shift was already complete. Because everyone had heard her, everyone had witnessed her boundary, stated plainly, unapologetically. And something remarkable happened next. The grandmother, matriarch of the family, rarely one to take sides openly, cleared her throat and said, "She seps right. She belongs here with us." The air thickened. It wasn't just approval, it was endorsement. A public acknowledgement that her role in this family was bigger than unpaid labor. For the first time, the invisible became visible. The bride raised her glass from across the hall and called out, "To family, and to all of us being present tonight." Applause erupted, brief but undeniable. And within it, her presence was sealed. That single reversal did more than defend her dignity. It reset the room. It sent ripples through the family's unspoken hierarchy. The babysitter label no longer stuck. The scapegoat role no longer fit. She had spoken, calmly, clearly, without venom, and the family had heard her. And she didn't just win for herself. She won for every cousin, every younger sibling, every girl watching who might have been drafted into that same role one day. Psychologists call this a pattern disruption combined with social proof, the moment when one person's quiet stand shifts not just their identity, but the collective narrative. She didn't set need to argue. She didn't set need to raise her voice. All she needed was truth spoken with composure and a room full of witnesses. That was the climax. The babysitter role had crumbled. The woman had emerged. And yet, victory always has an aftermath. Because when the old script collapses, not everyone celebrates. Some resist, some question, some plot to restore the old order. The celebration continued, but under the music and chatter, new currents were forming. Who would accept this shift? Who would resent it? And how would she carry this victory into the days that followed? The applause faded. The music swelled again. On the surface, the night moved forward as if nothing had shifted. But beneath that surface, everything had changed. She could feel it in the glances. Some approving, some unsettled, some calculating. Her aunt, the one who had scolded her at dinner, avoided eye contact altogether. Pride wounded, authority challenged, she busied herself fussing over centerpieces that didn't need fussing. Her uncle, the one who had made the babysitter joke, tried to reclaim ground with louder laughs and exaggerated stories, as if volume could erase what everyone had heard. But it couldn't. The words had landed. The silence after them had sealed it. Still, transformation never comes without cost. She could feel the quiet distance growing, with some relatives. The kind of distance that says, "You sever not playing by our rules anymore, so we don't but know how to place you." And that distance stung, because even as she stood taller, a part of her grieved the closeness she once had, even if that closeness was built on exploitation. But here's what that moment teaches us. Every act of liberation carries grief. You don't just lose the chains, you also lose the comfort of familiarity, the predictability of roles, even the illusion of peace. Yet not all was loss. Across the hall, she noticed her younger cousins watching her, wide-eyed, curious, almost reverent. One of them whispered, "She just said it," out loud. And in that whisper, she saw the seed of something new, a different future, a crack in the cycle. Her grandmother approached her later, slowly, leaning on her cane. She placed a hand on her shoulder and said softly, "You remind me of myself when I was young. I wish I had said no more often." The words caught her off guard. The matriarch, the woman who had been both the enforcer and the anchor of family tradition, was offering not resistance, but confession. It was redemption, quiet and unexpected. A reminder that even those who seemed complicit in the old patterns sometimes carried regrets they never voiced. She realized then her stand wasn't just about her. It was about healing something older, something generational. The bride, her cousin, glowing even through exhaustion, hugged her again before the night ended. "You don't know how much it meant to look out and see you there. I needed you as part of this, not tucked away. Thank you for being here." Her chest tightened. For all the tension, all the fallout, here was the purest truth. Her presence mattered. Not her service, not her sacrifice, her presence. And yes, some relatives left the night grumbling. Some whispered about her defiance. Some would carry bitterness into future gatherings. But others had seen something they couldn't unsee. A possibility, a model. A reminder that love without respect is not love at all. When she finally returned home, shoes in her hand, makeup fading, she sat on her bed and let the night wash over her. She had spoken. She had stood. She had stayed visible. And though the cost was real, though the family's dynamics would never feel quite the same, she felt something deeper than comfort. She felt freedom. And that freedom, once tasted, could never be untasted again, because liberation doesn't promise peace. It promises truth. and truth, when claimed, becomes unshakable. The babysitter had died. The woman had emerged, and tomorrow, the family, whether they liked it or not, would remember that. The wedding faded into memory. The music, the speeches, the photographs, they would all be stitched into family albums, replayed at anniversaries, recalled at reunions. But her quiet stand that night left a mark no camera could capture. For some it was an inconvenience, a disruption, a story to retell with annoyance. For others, it was a spark, a revelation, proof that roles we've been forced into can be rewritten. Weeks later, at another family gathering, she noticed something subtle. The children weren't automatically assigned to her. Other adults stepped in. Younger cousins rotated responsibility. It wasn't perfect, but it was different. That's the legacy of a single act of courage. The world doesn't flip overnight, but it begins to tilt. Here's what that moment teaches us. Boundaries are not walls to keep people out. They are doors that allow healthier relationships to step in. Her family had seen her not just as a caretaker, but as a full participant, and even those who resisted now had to grapple with a truth they couldn't erase. She was no longer invisible. But the deeper legacy went beyond her family. Because every person watching, you, me, anyone who has ever been cornered into a role they didn't choose, carries a version of this story. Maybe it's being the reliable worker who's asked to stay late without pay. Maybe it's the quiet friend who listens but is never listened to. Maybe it's the strong one in the family who isn't allowed to be tired. We all know what it feels like to be cast in a role that benefits others while draining us. And we all face the same question: do we keep playing the part, or do we risk everything to rewrite the script? Her story shows us that rewriting isn't easy. It comes with backlash, with grief, with moments of doubt, but it also creates space for truth. It liberates not just us, but those who are watching, waiting for someone to go first. She didn't set out to inspire her cousins. She didn't aim to shift her grandmother's perspective. She simply chose not to disappear. And that choice, simple, grounded, unapologetic, rippled outward into legacy. Psychologists call this social modeling, when one person's action becomes a template for others to believe they can act too. That's what makes this more than just her story. It's a story about us. So here is the moral call to action. Ask yourself, where are you disappearing in your own life? Where are you the babysitter for someone else's chaos, someone else's comfort, someone else's control? And what would it look like to simply say, no, tonight I belong at the table? Because the truth is, every time we choose presence over erasure, clarity over guilt, and dignity over exploitation, we don't just save ourselves. We tilt the system. We create space for someone else to breathe. And maybe, just maybe, one day, a younger cousin, or a colleague or a child will look at you and whisper, "They just said it," out loud. That whisper is how change begins. So if this story resonated with you, sit with it. Share it. Live it. And remember, your boundaries don't destroy love. They redefine it. A single action can flip an entire outcome. And sometimes, the bravest action is simply to take your rightful seat at the table. If this story spoke to you, if it reminded you of your own hidden battles and quiet victories, then I invite you to stay connected. Like, comment, and subscribe. Not just to hear more stories like this, but to join a community that believes in justice, resilience, and the quiet brilliance of rewriting our own narratives. Because we are not here to babysit a broken system. We are here to transform it.